Hi, I'm Jonathan Jaffe. I am the CISO of Lemonade Insurance, and I'm here to talk to you about bots and daiquiris. And on that note, I think I'll have a drink. Lemonade Insurance is a business to consumer company, and we have over 1 million policyholders. We're all cloud, 100%. Our security stack includes Datadog, it includes AWS, GuardDuty, it includes Orca, Cloudflare, Torque, a number of products. The one thing that is the focus of Lemonade more than anything else for efficiency and to deal with cloud scale is to automate as much as we can, and that includes security. And that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. It's a truism to say that attacks are up. It probably sounds even a bit trite. But to attackers, the cost is zero. I mean, think about it. When you can get a malware kit for $45 or a phishing as a service for $304 or a distributed denial of service attack, a managed service for $165, the cost is almost zero. That means more entrants. And as a corollary to that, as the cost is low, of course, the skill requirement is much, much lower as well. So now you have unskilled people, which draws in more people. And then finally, with cryptocurrency and residential proxies like NordVPN, there's essentially zero accountability. All of this results in having a higher frequency of attacks as the ease of attacks increases. So in 2019, you could say our attack surface looked like it was this. And just in the last couple of years, the attack surface just continues to get bigger as we have things like more extortion events or S3 ransom attacks and SaaS security or supply chain attacks. All of this basically means that the velocity of attacks increases, the frequency is increasing in a nonlinear fashion. The other problem is that as frequency increases, it increases nonlinearly. But when we hire staff really in fits and starts. We'll hire one to meet current needs. Maybe if we're lucky, we can hire another to meet projected needs. But because attacks are coming at a nonlinear rate, and we can't hire people at a nonlinear rate, we're always going to be short-staffed. So the answer to that clearly has to be automation. But first, I want you to meet the person who's responsible for doing the automation at Lemonade, and that's Eyal. Eyal likes to work efficiently, so he has more time to make cocktails. And with that, we'll see his driving motivation here is to make a good daiquiri. So I'm going to show you 3.5 or 4 automations that we've been working on. Really ones that Eyal has been working on, but I'm going to take credit for here in this talk. Now, certain things shouldn't be shared. Passwords, communicable diseases, and confidential data. Supply chain attacks are, as you know, all the rage. This compelled us at Lemonade to start looking for some way to pull in all of our file shares that we're doing through Google Workspaces. Now, I've spoken with a lot of peers, and they had me concerned because I'd heard about how that they were having supply chain attacks, and that was actually from attackers attacking somebody they use with whom they've shared files. So it wasn't because of their own lack of security, but it was because of third-party lack security. That made me concerned about how many files we might be sharing. So we ended up bringing in a company to help do an analysis for us. And I have to say I was surprised to see that we had quite a few files that were shared and forgotten. We brought in an Israeli startup called Wing Security, and we let Wing do an analysis for us. And they found that we had over 40,000 files that were shared and hadn't been touched in 60 days. Each file was often shared with more than one person. So if you consider one file shared with 2 people, 2 shares, we had over 75,000 files that were shared that hadn't been touched, hadn't been downloaded or looked at in 60 days by the people with whom they were shared. Now, sharing itself is fine, but forgotten shares just means you've got increased exposure. We also found that we had over 20 integrations with other apps that the API key hadn't been used in 60 days. So this is unnecessary exposure. And as you can imagine, with 75,000 shares, we had basically zero staff time to go through and look at each one of those. We needed an automated way to deal with it. So Wing came in and did an analysis for us. And they found that we have all of these shares. And then we used their service to notify users that start to have users unshare files. Now, what you see in this graph here is at one point we decided to let Wing do some of its automation as we tested out this startup. And one big chunk, I think in one day we closed down something like 30 or 35,000 shares, which was pretty impressive. Since that point, we've been letting it run semi-automatically as we move towards full confidence. And we have these old shares unshared after 60 days. Now we do notify our employees and let them know that we're going to unshare these files, but we are doing this automatically. Now, some other information that they presented for us is that you can see how we can unshare stuff, 35,000 files in one day, which is really just fantastic. But people still share stuff. And there are legitimate reasons to share files, so we don't want to just close down all shares. What we really want to do is we want to remind employees that sharing is fine if it meets our requirements, which is a legitimate business purpose, and it's limited in scope. So we decided we had to do something else ourselves. At the time of sharing, what we really wanted to do is we want to tell a user, hey, can you confirm that you really intended to share this file with an outside party? That would have two effects. One is it would make a user think twice, and the other, it was likely to close down or stop a share before it actually occurred if it wasn't really necessary. So what we did is, if you can follow the graph here, you'll see on the left we have Google Workspace. Google Workspace, every time a file is shared, will notify Datadog. And we have a service that we're using called Torque, an automation service. Torque has a webhook to Datadog. We've written rules in both Torque and Datadog to say whenever a certain type of share occurs, I want you to Slack the user and ask the user, hey, did you really intend to share this with so-and-so, which is information we pull from Datadog, or was it possibly a mistake? And you can see we send these messages to Slack and we ask for confirmation. And we found that is really quite good at reminding people that they should only share in certain situations. Before we started working with Wing and Datadog and Torque and doing all this through Slack, we really had 0% coverage on these shared files. There were too many, and we just didn't know about them. After we implemented our automations, we saw that resolution would happen within a minute of a share, which is pretty awesome. It took Eyal 0 effort, which meant that he can go and make a new cocktail. And we instantly got 100% coverage of all of our shares in Google Workspace. We're going to move on and try this with other services we use since it was so successful. All right, so the second automation is about malware. Now, we're 96% max, and we really do have very few incidents, but it does happen. You can see here, starting at the top left, that when a laptop does get some sort of malware, CrowdStrike, which is what we use, will notify CrowdStrike's command center. And then Torque, which has a webhook to CrowdStrike, will get a notification of that. And then what we'll do is, because CrowdStrike does a good job of stopping malicious software, we don't really have to worry about that so much. But part of our process is to create an incident response team that looks at the problem and makes sure no other damage has occurred. So we use Torque to open up a security incident response channel in Slack, invite the right people who are on call at that time within IT and security, And so we immediately get a response because we reach the right people at the right time. And then we follow up with asking the user, did you know there's this file that was running and CrowdStrike thinks that it might be illegitimate? Did you intend to run it? Is it legitimate or not? That has two effects. It makes the user aware that he or she may have downloaded something that's malicious, if that's what happened. And it gets the user to stop his or her work and focus on this incident and work with our team. We find that we don't have to chase employees down over longer periods of time to resolve these issues. So you can see here we create a channel. We pull the information from Jaffe, which is also something we use. We get the machine's name, we get the time stamp, and then we get the CrowdStrike reference. We invite the right people, and we very quickly, much more quickly anyway, bring the issue to resolution. So before automation, it might take on average 3 hours to complete resolution. And that would be because it just takes a while to get the right people together. It would take a few hours of effort, again, because there is a lot of back and forth. But coverage was 100%, which was nice. And then with automation, well, we've reduced some of the effort down to an average of about one hour to, I said resolution before, but I meant response. So about 1 hour to response time. About 45 minutes of effort, and we still have 100% coverage, and that gives AL a little more time to make a new kind of cocktail. So it works out well for everybody involved. All right, so our next automation, this is very impactful. This is how we fight bots with bots. Now, I'm proud of Lemonade. I'm proud of our design. I really believe we have the most beautiful, not just website, but phone app and consumer app out there. And if you haven't seen it, you should take a look. That attracts a lot of attention. Lemonade is a well-known brand. It has a lot of respect. It is in financial services. And so it also attracts some unwanted attention. We went public in 2020, and that also attracted a lot of unwanted attention from attackers. This is a day in the life of our web application as seen from Cloudflare, which is another service that we use. Here you see our web application firewall, all of the blocking that it does now. Now that we have our automation in place, we still get about 71,000 unique visits a day. We get over close to 6 million HTTP requests, and we get about 200 gigabytes a day of downloads. It's not heavy content, so that means it's actually a fair number of people. Some bots are good. Some bots, like search engine bots, are the kind of bots that you want when you're selling to consumers, but a lot of bots aren't. This shows you that there are a lot of bots that it's really just hard for even Cloudflare to tell if they're good or bad. So we've written some automation, or I should say AL has written this automation. What this automation does is the Cloudflare logs are fed into Datadog. All of our logging is fed into Datadog. But our Cloudflare logs, we then use some rules that we've set up in Datadog to look for specific types of attacks. Now, the type I'm going to show you now is a directory traversal attack. So when we see an HTTP request for something like Etsy password, we know that that is not legitimate, of course. Torque sees these Datadog signals, these security signals that come out of the rules that we write in Datadog. And then if it hasn't seen this IP before that's conducting the attack, what it will do is it will throw up a JavaScript challenge. It will write back to Cloudflare to throw up a JavaScript challenge to any subsequent requests from that IP. Now, IPs aren't dedicated to just one attacker. Oftentimes, you'll have legitimate requests coming from an IP, but you'll also have it shared by an attacker. So we have to be careful, make sure that the requests, we're not cutting off our own customers. We'll send a JavaScript challenge. If that isn't passed, then we will actually block that IP for a short period of time, for 15 minutes. We'll release that IP after 15 minutes. But then if we see another directory traversal from that same IP, say, you know what, this guy needs to be in the penalty box a little bit longer. So we're going to block that IP for an hour. Once we see that there are repeat requests coming, we can block that IP for a day. We could go longer, but we don't. But that's how we end up dealing with these thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of bot attacks a day on our website. Now, here in front of you, you see the rule that we wrote in Datadog. We have a number of these rules so we can block traffic. This is just one example. In Slack, you'll see what happens is after somebody fails a JavaScript challenge, we will then block that IP for 15 minutes, and we'll report to the security channel just so we're aware of it. And then after 15 minutes, we will have Torque write back to Cloudflare and remove that rule. One of the reasons we do that is because if we blocked every IP cumulatively over the course of half a year, we would probably end up blocking most of the internet. And while that's good for security, it's not really good for business. So we want to make sure that we're removing these rules cleanly as well. Here's an example of in half an hour time, you get 3 or 4 attacks from different IPs. It shows you how frequent we get these attacks. And then if somebody is really bad, then we put that IP into the penalty box for an hour, and we may do more after that. This is an example of how the attacks quickly escalate and then they're cut off because of these rules. And you can see we might release an IP blocking rule, and then that attacker comes back. And then, of course, we end up blocking that attacker. So it's been very effective. I think most interestingly is the amount of time and effort we save. So if we were to have done this by hand, it could take a couple of hours before we would get to blocking an IP. It would require doing some research in the logs. We would search in Datadog, analyzing it, making sure it's legitimate traffic, then going to Cloudflare and writing a rule. And then we have to remind ourselves to remove that rule after a period of time. Writing the rule takes 20 minutes of effort, but to get to the point where you want to block something, it could take a while longer. And really, because that's so much effort, we just simply couldn't do that. Now, it's pretty amazing. Now, we go no more than 2 minutes before we end up blocking malicious IP. Takes none of our effort, so AL gets to go and make another kind of cocktail. And we figure right now we get over 90% of the bot coverage that we're after. So that's a pretty good statistic. All right. For our next automation, this is one we're working on now. We don't have in production yet. But when somebody creates an S3 bucket, almost everything we do with that is automated through Pulumi. The one thing that we don't automate yet is writing the policy to only allow TLS connections to a bucket. And that's because it's an inline policy that has to be applied inline on the bucket. So we don't use our Pulumi building blocks to do that. We do ask developers to do it. In this automation that we're working with, what happens is Orca pulls in data from CloudTrail and from AWS. We have Torque with a webhook talking to Orca, listening to Orca. And when it sees a particular vulnerability, in this case, we call it a misconfiguration vulnerability, which is there's no TLS on an S3 bucket. What we do is we check with the developer, ask the developer, hey, did you forget to do something or was this intentional? And we can either go and write that inline policy, or we'll be able to when we have this in production, or we can ask the developer to do it, or we can make a note in Orca saying, here's the reason why we are not going to turn on TLS for that bucket. Most buckets don't need it because we don't have many externally facing buckets, but we do have a rule to have them all use TLS anyway. And so with that, those are our automations. That's how we do it at Lemonade. We definitely have more automations, but we find automation is about the only way that we can scale our security with the frequency and the rapidity of attacks that we see. And so we find automation is a key part of our strategy. The one thing that we can't automate, of course, is the making of a daiquiri. I will share one of Eyal's recipes here. a daiquiri. I'm actually not drinking, but because I'm working, but I'll make it look like I am. Is 1.5 parts of a good light rum, 1 part lime juice. I prefer Cointreau. I would use half a part of Cointreau. Some people like simple syrup, but it's not so good. Make sure you shake it really hard over ice and then sit back and drink while your bots do your work for you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Eyal.